Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. A Most Unusual Murder by Robert Bloch. Only the dead know Brooklyn. Thomas Wolfe said that, and he's dead now, so he ought to know. London, of course, is a different story. At least, that's the way Hilary Kane thought of it. Not as a story, perhaps, but rather as an old-fashioned, outsized, picaresque novel in which every street was a chapter crammed with characters and incidents of its own. Each block a page, each structure a separate paragraph, unto itself, within the sprawling, tangled plot. Such was Hilary Kane's concept of the city, and he knew it well. Over the years he strolled the pavements, reading the city sentence by sentence, until every line was familiar. He'd learned London by heart, and that's why he was so startled when, one bleak afternoon, late in November, he discovered the shop in Saxe-Coburg Square. "I'll be damned," he said. Probably Lester Woods, his companion, took the edge off the affirmation with an indulgent smile. "What's the problem?" "This." Kane gestured towards the tiny window of the establishment nestled inconspicuously between two residential relics of Victoria's day. "An antique place," Woods nodded. "At the rate they're springing up there must be at least one for every tourist in London." "But not here," Kane frowned. "I happen to have come by this way less than a week ago, and I'd swear there was no shop in the square." "Then it must have opened since." The two men moved up to the entrance, glancing through the display window in passing. Kane's frown deepened. "You call this new? Look at the dust on those goblets." "Playing detective again? Hmm?" Woods shook his head. "Trouble with you, Hilary, is that you have too many hobbies." He glanced across the square as a chill wind heralded the coming of twilight. "Getting late. We'd better move along." "Not until I find out about this." Kane was already opening the door, and Wood sighed. "The game is afoot, I suppose. All right, let's get it over with." The shop bell tinkled, and the two men stepped inside. The door closed, the tinkling stopped, and they stood in the shadows and the silence. But one of the shadows was not silent. It rose from behind the single counter in the small space before the rear wall. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," said the shadow, and switched on an overhead light. It cast a dim nimbus over the countertop and gave dimension to the shadow, revealing the substance of a diminutive figure with an unremarkable face beneath a balding brow. Kane addressed the proprietor. "Mind if we have a look?" "Is there any special area of interest?" The proprietor gestured towards the shelves lining the wall behind them. "Books? Maps? China? Crystal?" "Not really," Kane said. "It's just that I'm always curious about a new shop of this sort." The proprietor shook his head. "Begging your pardon, but it's hardly new." Woods glanced at his friend with a barely suppressed smile, but Kane ignored him. "Odd," Kane said. "I've never noticed this place before." "Quite so. I've been in business a good many years, but this is a new location." Now it was Kane's turn to glance quickly at Woods, and his smile was not suppressed. But Woods was already eyeing the artifacts on display, and after a moment, Kane began his own inspection. Peering at the shelving beneath the glass counter, he made a rapid inventory. He noted a boudoir lamp with a beaded fringe, a lavalier, a tray of pearly buttons, a Durbar souvenir program, and a framed and inscribed photograph of Matilda Alice Victoria Wood, a.k.a. Bella Delmare, a.k.a. Marie Lloyd. There were miscellaneous old jewelry, hunting watches, pewter mugs, napkin rings, a toy bank in the shape of a miniature crystal palace, and a display poster of a formidably mustached Lord Kitchener, with his gloved hand extended in a gesture of imperious command. It was, he decided, the mixture as before. Nothing unusual, and most of it, like the Kitchener poster, not even properly antique, but merely outmoded. Those fans on the bottom shelf, for example, and the silk toppers, the opera glasses, the black bag in the far corner covered with what was once called American cloth. Something about the phrase caught Kane to stoop and make a closer inspection. American cloth. Dusty now, but once shiny, like the tarnished silver nameplate identifying its owner. He read the inscription, J. Ridley, M.D. Kane looked up, striving to conceal his sudden surge of excitement. Impossible. It couldn't be, and yet it was. Keeping his voice and gesture carefully casual, he indicated the bag to the proprietor. A medical kit? Yes, I imagine so. Might I ask where you acquired it? The little man shrugged. Hard to remember. And this line one picks up the odd item here and there over the years. Might I have a look at it, please? The elderly proprietor lifted the bag to the countertop. Wood stared at it, puzzled, but Kane ignored him, his gaze intent on the nameplate below the lock. Would you mind opening it? He said. I'm afraid I don't have a key. Kane reached out and pressed the lock. It was rusted but firmly fixed. Frowning, he lifted the bag and shook it gently. Something jiggled inside, and as he heard the click of metal against metal, his elation peaked. Somehow, he suppressed it as he spoke. How much are you asking? The proprietor was equally emotionless. Not for sale. But, sorry, sir. It's against my policy to dispose of blind items. And since there's no telling what's inside. Look, it's only an old medical bag. I hardly imagine it contains the crown jewels. In the background, Wood snickered, but the proprietor ignored him. Granted, he said, but one can't be certain of the contents. Now the little man lifted the bag and once again there was a clicking sound. Coins, perhaps? Probably just surgical instruments, Kane said impatiently. Why don't you force the lock and settle the matter? Oh, I couldn't do that. It would destroy its value. What value? Kane's guard was down now. He knew he'd made a tactical error, but he couldn't help himself. The proprietor smiled. I told you the bag is not for sale. Everything has its price. Kane's statement was a challenge. The proprietor's smile broadened as he met it. £100. £100 for that? Woods grinned, then gaped at Kane's response. Done and done. But sir, for answer, Kane drew out his wallet and extracted 5 £20 notes. Placing them on the countertop, he lifted the bag and moved towards the door. Woods followed, hastily turning to close the door behind him. The proprietor gestured. Wait! Come back! But Kane was already hurrying down the street, clutching the black bag under his arm. He was still clutching it half an hour later as Woods moved with him into the spacious study of Kane's flat overlooking the verdant vista of Cadogan Square. Dappled blotches of sunlight reflected from the gleaming oilcloth as Kane set the bag on the table and carefully wiped away the film of dust with a dampened rag. He smiled triumphantly at Woods. Looks a bit better now, don't you think? I don't think anything, Woods shook his head. £100 for an old medical kit? A very old medical kit, said Kane. Dates back to the 80s, if I'm not mistaken. Even so, I hardly see. Of course you wouldn't. I doubt if anyone besides myself would attach much significance to the name of J. Ridley, M.D. Never heard of him. That's understandable, Kane smiled. He preferred to call himself Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper? Surely. You know the case. Whitechapel, 1888. The savage slaying and mutilation of prostitutes by a cunning mass murderer who taunted the police. A shadow, stalking his prey in the streets. Woods frowned. But he was never caught, was he? Not even identified. In that you're mistaken. No murderer has been identified quite as frequently as Red Jack. At the time of the crimes and over the years since, a score of suspects were named. A prime candidate was the Pole, Kolaski, alias George Chapman, who killed several wives. But poison was his method, and gain his motives, whereas the Ripper's victims were all penniless prostitutes who died under the knife. Another convicted murderer, Neil Cream, even openly proclaimed he was the Ripper. Wouldn't that be the answer then? Kane shrugged. Unfortunately, Cream happened to be in America at the time of the Ripper murders. Egomania prompted his false confession. He shook his head. Then there was John Pizer, a bookbinder known by the nickname of Leather Apron. He was actually arrested, but quickly cleared and released. Some think the killings were the work of a Russian called Konovalov, who also went by the name of Petachenko and worked as a barber surgeon. Supposedly he was a Tsarist secret agent who perpetrated the slayings to discredit the British police. Sounds pretty far-fetched if you ask me. Exactly, Kane smiled. But there are other candidates, equally improbable. Montague John Druitt, for one, a barrister of unsound mind who drowned himself in the Thames shortly after the last Ripper murder. Unfortunately, it has been established that he was living in Bournemouth, and on the day before and after the final slaying, he was there, playing cricket. Then there was the Duke of Clarence. Who? Queen Victoria's grandson in direct line of succession to the throne. Surely you're not serious. No, but others are. It has been asserted that Clarence was a known deviant who suffered from insanity as the result of venereal infection, and that his death in 1892 was actually due to the ravages of his disease. But that doesn't prove him to be the Ripper. Quite so. It hardly seems possible that he could write the letters filled with American slang and crude errors in grammar and spelling which the Ripper sent to the authorities, letters containing information which could be known only by the murderer and the police. More to the point, Clarence was in Scotland at the time of one of the killings, and at Sandringham when others took place, and there are equally firm reasons for exonerating suggested suspects close to him, his friend James Stephen and his physician Sir William Gull. You've really studied up on this, Woods murmured. I had no idea you were so keen on it. And for good reason. I wasn't about to make a fool of myself by advancing an untenable notion. I don't believe the Ripper was a seaman, as some surmise, for there's not a scintilla of evidence to back the theory. Nor do I think the Ripper was a slaughterhouse worker, a midwife, a man disguised as a woman, or a London bobby. And I doubt the very existence of a mysterious physician named Dr. Stanley, out to avenge himself against the woman who had infected him, or his son. But there do seem to be a great number of medical men among the suspects, Wood said. Right you are, and for good reason. Consider the nature of the crimes. The swift and skilled removal of vital organs, accomplished in the darkness of the streets, under constant danger of imminent discovery. All this implies the discipline of someone versed in anatomy, someone with the cool nerves of a practicing surgeon. Then, too, there's the matter of escaping detection. The Ripper obviously knew the alleys and byways of the East End so thoroughly that he could slip through police cordons and patrols without discovery. But if seen, who would have a better alibi than a respectable physician carrying a medical bag on an emergency call late at night? With that in mind, I set about my search, examining the rolls of London Hospital and Whitechapel Road. I went over the names of physicians and surgeons listed in the medical registry for that period. All of them? It wasn't necessary. I knew what I was looking for. A surgeon who lived and practiced in the immediate Whitechapel area. Whenever possible, I followed up with a further investigation of my suspects' histories, researching hospital and clinic affiliations, even hobbies and background activities, from medical journals, press reports, and family records. Of course, all this takes a great deal of time and patience. I must have been tilting at this windmill for a good 5 years before I found my man. Woods glanced at the nameplate on the bag. J. Ridley, M.D. John Ridley. Jack to his friends, if he had any. Kane paused thoughtful. But that's just the point. Ridley appears to have had no friends and no family. An orphan, he received his degree from Edinburgh in 1878, 10 years before the date of the murders. He set up private practice here in London, but there is no office address listed. Nor is there any further information to be found concerning him. It's as though he took particular care to suppress every detail of his personal and private life. This, of course, is what roused my suspicions. For an entire decade, J. Ridley lived and practiced in the East End without a single mention of his name anywhere in print, except for his registry listing. And after 1888, even that disappeared. Suppose he died. There is no obituary on record. Wood shrugged. Perhaps he moved, immigrated, took sick, abandoned practice. Then why the secrecy? Why conceal his whereabouts? Don't you see, it's the very lack of such ordinary details which leads me to suspect the extraordinary. But that's not evidence. There's no proof that your Dr. Ridley was the Ripper. That's why this is so important. Kate indicated the bag on the tabletop. If we knew its history, where it came from. As he spoke, Kane reached down and picked up a brass letter opener from the table, then moved to the bag. Wait! Woods put a straining hand on Kane's shoulder. That may not be necessary. What do you mean? I think the shopkeeper was lying. He knew what the bag contains. He had to, or else. Why did he fix such a ridiculous price? He never dreamed you'd take him up on it, of course. But there's no need for you to force the lock any more than there was for him to do so. My guess is that he has a key. You're right. Kane set the letter opener down. I should have realized, if I'd taken the time to consider his reluctance. He must have the key. He lifted the shiny bag and turned. Come along. Let's get back to him before the shop closes. And this time, we won't be put off by any excuses. Dusk had descended as Kane and his companion hastened through the streets, and darkness was creeping across the deserted silence of Saxe-Coburg Square when they arrived. They halted then, staring into the shadows, seeking the spot where the shop nestled between their residences, looming on either side. The shadows were deeper here, and they moved closer, only to stare again at the empty gap between the two buildings. The shop was gone. Woods blinked and turned and gestured to Kane. But we were here. We saw it. Kane didn't reply. He was staring at the dusty rubble-strewn surface of the space between the structures, at the weeds which sprouted from the bare ground beneath. A chill night wind echoed through the emptiness. Kane stopped, sifted a pinch of dust between his fingers. The dust was cold, like the wind that whirled the fine grains from his hand and blew them away into the darkness. What happened? Woods was murmuring. Could we both have dreamed? Kane stood erect, facing his friend. This isn't a dream, he said, gripping the black bag. Then what's the answer? I don't know, Kane frowned thoughtfully. But there's only one place where we can possibly find it. Where? The 1888 medical registry lists the address of John Ridley as number 17 Dorcas Lane. The cab which brought them to Dorcas Lane could not enter its narrow access-way. The dim alley beyond was silent and empty, but Kane plunged into it without hesitation, moving along the dark passages between solid rows of grimy brick. Treading over the cobblestones, it seemed to Woods that he was being led into another era, yet Kane's progress was swift and unfaltering. You've been here before, Woods said. Of course. Kane halted before the unlighted entrance to number 17, then knocked. The door opened, not fully, but just enough to permit the figure behind it to peer out at them. Both glance and greeting were guarded. What you want? Kane stepped into the fan of light from the partial opening. Good evening. Remember me? Yes. The door opened wider, and Woods could see the squat shadow of the middle-aged woman who nodded up at his companion. You're the one what rented the back vacancy last bank holiday, ain't you? Right. I was wondering if I might have it again. I don't know. The woman glanced at Woods. Only for a few hours. Kane reached for his wallet. My friend and I have a business matter to discuss. Business, huh? Woods felt the unflattering appraisal of the landlady's beady eyes. Cost you a fiver. Here you are. A hand extended to grasp the note. Then the door opened fully, revealing the dingy hall and the stairs beyond. Mind the steps now, the landlady said. The stairs were steep, and the woman was puffing as they reached the upper landing. She led them along the creaking corridor to the door at the rear, fumbling for the keys in her apron. Here we are. The door opened on musty darkness, scarcely dispelled by the faint illumination of the overhead fixture as she switched it on. The landlady nodded at Kane. I don't rent this for lodgings no more. It ain't properly made up. Quite all right, Kane smiled, his hand on the door. If there's anything you'll be needing, best tell me now. I've got to run over to the neighbor's for a bit. She's been took ill. I'm sure we'll manage. Kane closed the door, then listened for a moment as the landlady's footstep receded down the hall. Well, he said, what do you think? Wood surveyed the shabby room with its single window framed by yellowing curtains. He noted the faded carpet with its pattern well nigh worn away, the marred and chipped surfaces of the massive old bureau and heavy Moorish chair, the brass bed covered with a much-mended spread, the ancient gas log in the fireplace, framed by a cracked marble mantelpiece, and the equally cracked washstand fixture in the corner. I think you're out of your mind, Wood said. Did I understand correctly that you've been here before? Exactly. I came several months ago, as soon as I found the address in the registry. I wanted a look around. Woods wrinkled his nose. More to smell than there is to see. Use your imagination, man. Doesn't it mean anything to you that you're standing in the very room once occupied by Jack the Ripper? Woods shook his head. There must be a dozen rooms to let in this old barn. What makes you think this is the right one? The registry entry specified rear, and there are no rear accommodations downstairs. That's where the kitchen is located. So this has to be the place. Kane gestured. Think of it. You may be looking at the very sink where the Ripper washed away the traces of his butchery, the bed in which he slept after his dark deeds were performed. Who knows what sights this room has seen and heard? The voice crying out in a tormented nightmare. Come off it, Hilary, Woods grimaced impatiently. It's one thing to use your imagination, but quite another to let your imagination use you. Look, Kane pointed to the far corner of the room. Do you see those indentations in the carpet? I noticed them when I examined this room on my previous visit. What do they suggest to you? Woods peered dutifully at the worn surface of the carpet, noting the four round, evenly spaced marks. Must have been another piece of furniture in that corner. Something heavy, I'd say. But what sort of furniture? Well, Woods considered. Judging from the space, it wasn't a sofa or a chair. Could have been a cabinet, perhaps a large desk. Exactly. A roll-top desk. Every doctor had one in those days, Kane sighed. I'd give a pretty penny to know what became of that item. It might have held the answer to all our questions. After all these years? Not bloody likely. Woods glanced away. Didn't find anything else, did you? I'm afraid not. As you say, it's been a long time since the Ripper stayed here. I didn't say that, Woods shook his head. You may be right about the desk, and no doubt the medical registry gives a correct address. But all it means is that this room may once have been rented by a Dr. John Ridley. You've already inspected it once. Why bother to come back? Because now I have this. Kane placed the black bag on the bed. And this, he produced a pocket knife. You intend to force the lock after all? In the absence of a key, I have no alternative. Kane wedged the blade under the metal guard and began to pry upwards. It's important that the bag be opened here. Something it contains may very well be associated with this room. If we recognize the connection, we might have an additional clue. A conclusive link. The lock snapped. As the bag sprang open, the two men stared down at its contents. The jumbles of vials and pill boxes, the clumsy old-style stethoscope, the probes and tweezers, the roll of gauze, and resting atop it the scalpel with its steel-tipped surface encrusted with brownish stains. They were still staring at the door open quietly behind them, and the balding, elderly little man entered the room. I see my guess was correct, gentlemen. You too have read the medical registry. He nodded. I was hoping I'd find you here. Kane frowned. What do you want? I'm afraid I must trouble you for my bag. But it's my property now. I bought it. The little man sighed. Yes. And I was a fool to permit it. I thought putting on that price would dissuade you. How was I to know you were a collector like myself? Collector? Of curiosa pertaining to murder, the little man smiled. A pity you cannot see some of the memorabilia I've acquired. Not the commonplace items associated with your so-called Black Museum in Scotland Yard, but true rarities with historical significance, he gestured. The silver jar in which the notorious French sorceress Lavoisin kept her poisonous ointments. The actual dirks which dispatched the unfortunate nephews of Richard III in the Tower. Yes, even the poker responsible for the atrocious demise of Edward II at Berkeley Castle on the night of September 21st, 1327. I had quite a bit of trouble locating it until I realized the date was reckoned according to the old Julian calendar. Kane frowned impatiently. Who are you? What happened to that shop of yours? My name would mean nothing to you. As for the shop, let us say that it exists spatially and temporally, as I do, when and where necessary for my purpose. By your current and limited understanding, you might call it a sort of time machine. Woods shook his head. You're not making sense. Ah, but I am. And very good sense, too. How else do you think I could pursue my interests so successfully unless I were free to travel in time? It is my particular pleasure to return to certain eras in this primitive past of yours, visiting the scenes of famous and infamous crimes, and locating trophies for my collection. The shop, of course, is just something I used as a blind for this particular mission. It's gone now, and I shall be going too, just as soon as I retrieve my property. It happens to be the souvenir of a most unusual murder. You see, Kay nodded at Woods, I told you this bag belonged to the Ripper. Not so, said the little man. I already have the Ripper's murder weapon, which I retrieved directly after the slaying of his final victim on November 9th, 1888. And I can assure you that Dr. Ridley was not Jack the Ripper, but merely and simply an eccentric surgeon. As he spoke, he edged toward the bed. No, you don't. Kane turned to intercept him, but he was already reaching for the bag. Let go of that, Kane shouted. The little man tried to pull away, but Kane's hand swooped down frantically into the open bag and clawed. Then it rose, gripping the scalpel. The little man yanked the bag away. Clutching it, he retreated as Kane bore down upon him fiercely. Stop! Woods cried. Hurling himself forward, he stepped between the two men directly into the orbit of the descending blade. There was a gurgle and a thud as he fell. The scalpel clattered to the floor, slipping from Kane's nerveless fingers and coming to rest amidst the crimson stain that seeped and spread. The little man stooped and picked up the scalpel. Thank you, he said softly. You have given me what I came for. He dropped the weapon into the bag. Then he shimmered, and disappeared. But Wood's body didn't disappear. Kane stared down at it, at the throat ripped open from ear to ear. He was still staring when they came and took him away. The trial, of course, was a sensation. It wasn't so much the crazy story Kane told as the fact that nobody could ever find the fatal weapon. It was a most unusual murder. The Haunted Chair by Stephen F. Wilcox. The Turnicks first approached me about their haunted chair one Sunday morning in April, buttonholing me in the gravel parking lot next to the church. It was the first truly warm spring day of the year after 4 months of long and bitter winter in upstate New York, and I wasn't eager to spend any of it listening to a superstitious yarn. I had a yard to mow and a garden plot that needed turning, but conscience and the morning sermon held me. I already knew something of the Turnick's dilemma, thanks to our church pastor, the Reverend James. He had spoken to me about it the previous Thursday, following our weekly youth counseling session with a few of the congregation's teenagers. It seems Mr. and Mrs. Turnick are suffering under the delusion that old Mr. Breck, Mrs. Turnick's late father, has been paying nocturnal visits. Reverend James told me they've obviously been under a great deal of strain since the old gentleman passed on in February, and frankly, I'm worried about the both of them. They're quiet, almost stoic people by nature, so I know it took a great deal of soul-searching for them to ask for help. I've done what I can to encourage them to deal with their problem rationally. I even suggested psychiatric evaluation, but they won't hear of it. Then I brought up your name and suggested you might be of help. They took to the idea immediately. I hope you don't mind. It's not that I mind exactly, Reverend, I hedged, but what good could I possibly do? You study psychology in college, and your volunteer work with the church's youth counseling program has been exemplary. Still, I'm hardly qualified for something like this. I'm a newspaper man, not Sigmund Freud. Ah, but there's the beauty of it, the good pastor smiled devilishly. You see, I believe you may be able to provide the Turnics with sage counsel. I knew, however, that they would be reluctant to open up to you in such a role, so I sold them the idea on the basis of your experience as a newsman, investigative journalism and all that. Reverend James, I publish and edit a small town weekly, not the Washington Post. He patted my arm reassuringly. Totally irrelevant for our purposes. The important thing is your willingness to lend your counseling skills to a neighbor in need. Yes? Say that might make for a good sermon this Sunday. Help thy neighbor. And so it was that I found myself in the church parking lot on a sunny Sunday morning, listening to a tale that would have been ludicrous if not for the utterly sincere look of pain etched into the face of Ruth Turnick. My father hadn't a sick day in his life until the last couple of years, Mrs. Turnick began. She was a tall, heavy-boned woman in her late 40s, her mouse-brown hair strewn with gray. He kept the farm up nice, did the chores with Arno here. She nodded toward her husband. Even pitched in with the hay in every summer, right up to the age of 75. That's when he started having the problems with his lungs. Caught pneumonia 2 years ago last October, and went downhill from there. The doctors found something bad with his heart, too. A weak valve, they said. Anyway, he was in the hospital from last Christmas to the middle of January. Bills were beginning to eat us alive, so the doctors let us take him home to look after him ourselves. That was my job. Only I don't guess I did too good. Now, woman, don't start that again, Mr. Turnick cut in. He was an angular man in his mid-50s, with a windburned face and a freckled scalp where hair used to grow. He wore thick glasses that made his eyes appear unnaturally small and sunken. She goes on that way sometimes, the farmer said to me. Even the old Da, that's what we called Ruth's dad, had one foot in the grave the minute he set foot in the hospital. Blames herself 'cause she was off to do the grocery shopping when old Da had his last fit and died. Figures she could have done something if she'd been home, but that don't make sense. It was God's will is all. I made the appropriate noises of sympathy and then, in spite of my misgivings, asked them to tell their story. Well, it started about a month after Doll passed on, Miss Turnick said. I come downstairs one morning and smelled Doll's old burley pipe tobacco. Arno here, he's a chewer, don't smoke at all. So I figured I must be dreaming. But when I go into the living room, I find old Doll's pipe sitting in the ashtray and his easy chair up next to the fireplace, just the way he had it. I interrupted. You mean the chair had been moved? She nodded. After he passed on, you see, I put his chair and smokestand off in the corner so we could watch the television better. Only there it was, right back by the fireplace. Well, I asked Arno here if he did it, though I couldn't imagine why he'd be moving stuff and smoking Daw's old pipe and everything. Course not, Mr. Turnick growled. Anyhow, his wife continued, we couldn't figure it out at all, except maybe someone got in the house some way in the night and did it. Who knows why? So after a while, we just stopped thinking about it and went on about our chores. What else could we do? I nodded my agreement, and she went on. Well, next morning when Arnold comes down to head out to the milk barn, he takes a look and darned if that old chair isn't right back in front of the fireplace again, pipe lying out and the ashes in the ashtray. And it kept on like that for a week. I'd have moved the chair and smokestand back in the corner next morning. It's back in front of the fireplace. Like I say, this goes on for a week, and finally Arnold here, he says he's had enough. He don't believe in ghosts, and he's gonna get to the bottom of this thing, even if it costs him a night's sleep. So he decides to sit up and watch the chair. I was still reluctant to get involved, but I'll admit I was warming to the tale. What happened that night, I asked. Turnick shrugged. I fell asleep. Ain't used to them late hours. Farm people, we gotta get up early. I remember I was watching that Carson fell on the TV, and I just dozed off. Didn't wake up till near 5 o'clock. When I did, the TV had nothing but snow on it, and that old chair was right back in front of the fireplace. Was all I had a chance to say before Mrs. Turnick resumed the strange story. I guess I'm trying to stay up the next night and see if I could do better. Arnold went up to bed around 9:30, and I sat there on the sofa with my crewel work, watching the television with one eye and that old chair with the other. Along about midnight, I remember I was watching some news show with some fella, looked a little like Howdy Doody. I all of a sudden smelled pipe tobacco, so I sort of blinked my eyes and quick look over at the chair, and had it moved again. Happened so fast, I never really saw it. It was just there. You're sure you didn't fall asleep? I don't think so. I was sleepy, I remember. I could have closed my eyes for a few seconds, I suppose. You know how it is when you get so relaxed, you get kind of drowsy. Anyway, I sure stayed awake the rest of the night. I mean, I even tried talking to him, to the chair. Kept asking why are you doing this? I told him how sorry I was, but nothing came of it. He didn't answer me back. With that, Mrs. Turnick lowered her head and tried to suppress a deep sob. She failed. Her husband began to raise a hand to comfort her, then dropped it to his side. Instead, he squinted at me through his thick glasses lenses and implored, "Can't you just see what this haunting is doing to us? We gotta do something. Somebody's gotta help us. Make 'em go away." I had them go over their story again, point by point, inserting a question here and there, all the while hoping to latch on to a plausible explanation that might satisfy them and get me out of it. I dredged up what psychobabble I could recall from college lectures, tried reasoning with them as I could with one of the troubled teens in my youth counseling group, and as a last resort, I badly posited that grief and guilt over old Mr. Breck's death had somehow created hysteria that was causing them to hallucinate, but they weren't having any of it. Ironically, they found it easier to believe that old Daw was hunting their living room than to accept the possibility of mental aberration within themselves. I then decided on the obvious tack and suggested they remove from the house the chair, the smoke stand and pipe, anything that belonged to Mr. Brecht. Unfortunately, they weren't having any of that either. "The missus here, she don't want to let go of none of old Da's stuff," Turnick said, sounding equal parts frustrated and disgusted. "Claims it's all she's got left of the old man." "Wouldn't do any good anyhow. Getting rid of those few things," his wife defended herself. "Sakes alive, everything in the house used to be Da's. Almost, including the house. It was him that first owned the farm, you see. Arnold came on as a partner, like, after we married. So we'd have to get rid of the whole house. Then he'd probably start turning up in the milk barn." It was a peculiar piece of logic, and admittedly, but at the time I could think of nothing to refute it. There was a long silence, the Turnicks staring at me expectantly, while I ground the toe of my best black shoe into the gravel of the parking lot. It seemed I had no choice, so I offered to go out to the farm and spend the night on the Turnick sofa. There was an explanation, I knew, one that didn't include the ghost of old Mr. Breck haunting his favorite chair. Perhaps I am burdened with a baggage of guilt and superstition that weighed down these simple people, could expose the truth behind their torment, whatever it might be. With the demands of putting out the weekly paper, I was unable to make it out to the Turnick farm until the following Thursday. In the interim, when I wasn't busy rewriting the Kiwanis Club monthly news bulletin or covering the 4-H fair at the high school, or any of a dozen other duties associated with a small town newspaper, I managed to stop by the library and peruse everything I could find on parapsychology and unexplained phenomena. What sparse and inconclusive information I was able to dig up merely served to convince me that I was a fool to let the Reverend involve me in the affair in the first place. Nevertheless, I drove out to the farm around 7 o'clock that Thursday evening as agreed. The Turnicks looked even more drawn and subdued than they had on Sunday, stood waiting for me on the porch of the house. It was a large, vaguely Victorian place of gabled roof lines and intricate lattice work, which on the whole could have been handsome with a fresh coat of paint. After a somber, perfunctory meeting, My host ushered me into a long, rectangular living room with a huge brick fireplace at one end, several pieces of overstuffed furniture hugging the walls, and a flowery carpet stretched across the floor. The chair and smoking stand that had prompted my visit were tucked off into a corner several feet removed from the fireplace. Up till this morning, we've been living in the chair and doll spot over by the fireplace, Mrs. Turnick explained matter-of-factly, figuring why keep moving it back to the corner since it don't stay put anyhow. I had Arno here, move it back this morning, though so you could see for yourself what we mean. In the morning, I mean. Didn't anything happen while the chair was left in its old spot by the fire, I asked. Mrs. Turnick nodded. He still come by every night to smoke that old briar pipe. I know, 'cause every morning I have to dump out the ashtray. The first half of the evening was uneventful, and ever since. We each staked out a seat in the living room, leaving the late Mr. Breck's favorite chair unoccupied, of course, and watched a procession of television shows, a moronic game show, a half-decent detective serial, a couple of improbable sitcoms, each stuffed with enough corn to fill the Turnick silo. Tried several times to engage my host in a discussion of the possible psychological reasons behind their haunted chair, employing every buzzword and catchphrase I could remember from my research. But my attempts were rebuffed with skeptical mumblings and knowing glances from husband to wife and back again. At 9:30 precisely, as the schoolhouse clock on the mantel chimed once for the half hour, Ruth Turnick brought from the kitchen a steaming pot of tea and a dish of homemade oatmeal cookies. Arnaud Turnick stood yawned, as only a farmer can yawn at the end of a hard day, and shuffled off to bed. You keep awake now, Mrs. Turnick admonished me as she followed her husband up the stairs. You'll see how it is. I waited a few pregnant minutes until I heard a toilet flush, a closet door slam, and a set of bed springs moan. Then, satisfied that my host had retired, I began a thorough examination of the living room, although I couldn't say what I expected to find. I looked behind the sofa, I drew back the drapes, I got on hands and knees and rolled back a corner of the carpet, I flicked lamps on and off and on again, I even stirred the ashes in the grate. Last, and I admit not without some irrational but heartfelt trepidation, I inspected the inside of the old man's smokestand. Nothing unusual there, and gently eased myself into the mysterious chair. As expected, nothing happened. No tingling sensations, no sudden chills along the spine, no groaning protests from disembodied voices in the night. I was simply sitting in a tattered Morris chair, all alone in a dowdy living room. Satisfied with my own sanity, at least I got up and returned to the sofa, where I set to work on the tea and cookies. The schoolhouse clock on the mantel chimed 12 times, the fabled witching hour. I reminded myself with a somewhat self-conscious chuckle. The cookies were gone, as was most of the tea in the heavy pewter pot that rested on the end table beside me. Perhaps Mr. Breck's ghost was gone too, for it surely hadn't disturbed the furniture this night. I had spent the previous 2 hours staring into the corner at the chair and smokestand, almost daring them to move, while at the same time I tried to think of a way to get through to the Turnicks when they came down for breakfast in the morning, something that might jar them back to reality. It was then that I heard footsteps above me, quiet and slow, making their way from the second floor bedroom to the top of the stairway. I twisted around on the sofa and watched as a pair of pink fuzzy feet descended behind the balustrade. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, I realized that the slippered feet belonged to Mrs. Turnick. I started to stand and to speak, but the vacuous look in her eyes held me in place. Her long flannel nightgown billowing out from her sides, she walked past me as if I didn't exist and strode to the corner where her father's chair and smokestand sat waiting. Noiselessly on the heavy carpet, she slid the smokestand across the room to a spot next to the fireplace. Mrs. Turnick, I called to her softly. She didn't reply, but instead pushed the cumbersome Morris chair until it joined the smokestand beside the fireplace, and then she sat down. Mrs. Turnick, I tried again more forcefully. Again no acknowledgement. Standing, I positioned myself halfway between the sofa and the fireplace and watched. Fascinated, she took her father's briar from the stand, slowly filled it with fibrous burley tobacco, and lit the bowl with a wooden kitchen match. Of course, I mumbled to myself, as she puffed away contentedly, still oblivious to my presence. You just couldn't shake loose that guilt of your father dying when you weren't there to help him. So you bring him back to his favorite spot every night, a contented old man nursing his pipe in front of the fire. I knew there had to be a logical explanation, I thought, giving myself a mental pat in the back as I turned and headed toward the stairs. Simple enough now to fetch Mr. Turnick and let him witness the scene for himself, after which we could gently awaken his troubled wife and go from there. No. I was halfway across the room when I heard it, a deep guttural cry that arrested me in mid-stride. I turned back to Mrs. Turnick, who was now staring up at me from the chair, her eyes burning like the pipe she held in her hand. I had nearly convinced myself that I had imagined the cry, having an old man's ragged voice I had heard, when her mouth opened again and another incongruous rumbling roared from her lips. Murder. Startled out of my paralysis, I jumped backward into the end table. The clatter of the heavy pewter tea service as it hit the floor resounded through the house, but Ruth Turnick's smoldering gaze remained steady. Now came heavy footsteps, hurrying across the ceiling and down the stairs. I lost all equilibrium and fell back into the sofa just as Arnold Turnick came through the living room archway, his bathrobe hanging on him like a shroud, his eyes, without the heavy spectacles, blinking furiously against the lamplight, his hands gripping a shotgun. You murderer, came again the old man's voice from the woman in the chair. No, Da, Arnold Turnick cried, his eyes squinting, terror and confusion amplifying his words. You were already dying. There was no use. The doctor's bills, eating away our savings. You... The terrible alien voice screamed as Ruth Turnick, her arm outstretched, finger pointing at her husband, began to rise from the Morris chair. I remember seeing her body lift up suddenly and slam against the fireplace, while in the same frozen instant a deafening gun blast voided all else. Then time began again, and Mrs. Turnick lay in a heap upon the hearth, her flannel nightgown dotted everywhere crimson, her mouth bleeding like an open sore. And Arnold Turnick, shotgun lying at his feet, standing still as death in the archway, eyes fixed on the empty chair, softly saying over and over again, Had to, Da. Had to, Da. Had to, Da. It wasn't until Arnold Turnick's trial for manslaughter that the whole story came out. The medical bills piling up, the second mortgage due on the farm. In March, the old man lying up in his room and dying a day at a time, but somehow hanging on. Until the morning, Ruth went off to shop, and Arnold came in from the milk barn and heard the dreadful wheezing. There was old Mr. Breck on the bedroom floor, gasping for the pills that sat on the bureau not 10 feet away. Arnold stood in the doorway and looked at the old man, and the old man looked at him, and both knew the pills would never leave the bureau. The trial was over by early June, just as the strawberries in my garden became ready. Arnold was put away in a hospital with barred windows and steel doors. Ruth already rested beside her father in the little cemetery next to our church. How she knew what Arnold had done? Well, that was just one of many questions that none of us could answer. Of course, the newspapers in the city wrote the story up big, but I never wrote it up at all. It just wasn't the kind of thing that belonged in a small town weekly. At least, not in mine.